Hi guys, my name is Tyreek Emerson, and today we're going to be diving deep into the book The Hate You Give, and we're going to be looking into what are some of the causes and effects of growing up in a marginalized minority field area, analyzing some of the different spaces in the novel, and then we're going to be looking at some of those and seeing what the different locations represent and what ideologies are attached to each space. So the first person that we're going to start with is Star, the main character of the book. So Star grows up in Garden Heights, which is a predominantly black area. And some of the causes and effects of growing up in that marginalized minority field area were that, from my observation, where she grew up in this area where killing and gun violence were two things that she's seen pretty often, and that was kind of like common within the area. And we see her as she grows up, she has like this fear of not knowing kind of like what it means to be black within a white space, because she has to code switch, and what she's doing in Garden Heights versus what she does at school is two different things. But growing up in this area, it kind of left her with trauma to where she kind of wanted to shy away from what the stigma was. When you grew up in an area where gun violence is kind of dominant in that area, the news kind of puts off this image to the world that it's a pretty terrible place. So you growing up in that area, you kind of try to separate yourself from it, and I think that's what we see Star does a lot. Some of the causes and effects. If we just look at what Garden Heights represents, I think some of the effects were she was having that identity crisis of not knowing who to be or where she could be herself at. And I think the cause of that were just how the news portrayed the area, how whites outside of that area will portray the area, and also kind of the conditions in which they grew up in. You have like vacant buildings, you have not very many food options, you have not very many businesses, like big business, when you grow up in an area like that. And I think some of those effects are people wanting to move out of their area because into the suburbs or the white areas, thinking that that is what's best or what's better. And yeah, so that's for Garden Heights. As for Star, at school, I think that was one of like the main areas outside of Garden Heights where Star really like, where we really got to see where her character was like at school. Because at school she went to a predominantly white high school, and her brother also went there as well. But she herself was one of the only black girls in her class. It wasn't very many. It was probably about five black people in her class. And just analyzing that space, growing, like, she went to a predominantly white high school, which is totally different from like what kids were like in Garden Heights were doing. Like, everybody in Garden Heights went to school with other black children from Garden Heights, but her going to school in the white field space, this is where we kind of see her identity crisis starts to happen. And I think that's one of the effects of a black person being one of the very few black people in a predominantly white space. So the identity crisis, what that looks like is she kind of battled between what she could be at home and what she had to be at school. She would code switch a lot. She wouldn't say certain words. She wouldn't catch attitudes with people. She always wanted to seem perfect because she didn't want to be the stereotypical black girl. She didn't really check people when they said like racially motivated things, or if they had said anything about black people, she kind of would shy away from it because she didn't want to be that black person that kind of checked everyone and made people realize that the things that were happening like outside of that space were wrong. And I think just her doing that, I feel like that kind of puts a lot of pressure on a child. Like as a parent, sending your child to a predominantly white space like that, you're sending them into a very unknown environment. And even though if at home you teach them like what it means to be black, like if that's not what they're around, that makes it kind of hard because they're not seeing you from their peers. They don't know, like they see it, but they don't get to partake in it, like participate in it, which can be kind of hard. Like if we revert back to it in the very beginning of the book, um, they were at a party, and that party was much different from the parties that Stars used to go to at her school, just because it's a culture difference and things like that. It's kind of, she didn't kind of feel comfortable in a party with people that look like her when it should be the other way around, or she should at least be comfortable enough in both. And I think that's one of the main effects of going to school in an area like that. That also, that space, like what it represented for Star, it represented like, I would say it represented like a safe haven for her, like a space where she felt safe because she was going through that identity crisis. She didn't feel comfortable at home in Garden Heights because she went to school outside of Garden Heights, but she also didn't feel comfortable at school because she lived and came from Garden Heights, which kind of like conflicts with the two. But I think that space, it kind of gave her like peace. Like she felt like she can be somebody else outside of what people expected from her, at least like in her own community. Um, she kind of like viewed herself as being different from like the other black children that she grew up with or that came from the same area as her. So when she went away to school, it was kind of like she can get away from everything that goes on back at home. And specifically the Khalil situation, that place was her peace because back at home, everybody knew what was going on with Khalil. But at school, nobody really knew. It made the news, so people kind of knew, but they didn't know that it was her that was directly tied to that situation. So her being in school was kind of like a space for her to clear her head up until we see kind of towards the end where her friends kind of start to realize that it's her, and then like the things that was happening in her community start to take a toll on her at school. Um, and I think that also is another effect of sending your child to a predominantly white school. When something happens in their community, they don't have anyone that they can turn to feel comfortable with. Like for me, example, I've always went to predominantly black schools. So in high school, if there was a shooting, like if a cop killed a black kid, as for instance Trayvon Martin, that happened my freshman year of high school. I was around other black students that kind of like we helped each other understand that situation and walk through that situation. Also, the parents and teachers and doing the same thing, but it's different when it comes from students that look like you, students that you're comfortable with, helping you like kind of understand a situation like that because you're all doing it as a collective. Um, versus if I was to go to school, a predominantly white school, it would be different where like I would probably have to like, I would hear about it, but I would have to like hold in my thoughts, my comments, because I wouldn't feel comfortable sharing that with those people like in that school. Um, yeah, so my second character that I was going to get into was Maverick, Big Math. He was a pretty cool character. I really liked him just because of what he stood for, the ideologies and the principles that he kind of stood on are some of the same that I stand on. So with him growing up in Garden Heights, so he grew up, that's Star's father, and he was a gang member. He had joined when he was a teenager, but as he got older, he kind of shied away from it. He ended up going to jail, and he ended up having Star right as he went to jail, and that's when he wanted to have that life difference. And I think that's one of the effects and causes of growing up in a marginalized like minority field area, is that a lot of people tend to turn to gangs to for comfort or just like protection or just like trying to have that father figure that older person, that big homie, in which we like to say. You kind of turn to gang banging as that like escape goat for you, um, especially because that's what everybody else around you is doing. And then also just like when you're growing up in a poor area like that, a lot of people that like in those areas are poor or living on welfare and government assistance. So when you're growing up in something like that and you kind of want better for yourself, you kind of turn to gangs because they're the ones that get the quick money. They're the ones that can help you in those tough situations when you do need quick money versus trying to find a job and working for minimum wage, which can be pretty low, especially in a time like when Maverick was growing up. Like I would assume he grew up in the late 80s, early 90s. So minimum wage is pretty low. And when you need money and things like that, you kind of turn to the streets to do so. Um, I think what Garden Heights represented for Maverick, it was a place of hope. This was a place where he seen that his life changed, and a place that changed his life, and he kind of wants to do the same for others. Like he grew up, he was a gang member. He had got a job at the grocery store, which later the owner of the grocery store ended up giving that store to Maverick to run and have as his own. And I think that's why Maverick kind of like Garden Heights held such like a high place in his life because Garden Heights is what kind of changed and helped save his life. I mean, you can also say the same for prison for him, but Garden Heights, like the grocery store, was kind of what changed his mindset and led him on the legal route to getting money and taking care of his family. And I think that's kind of what his message, what he wanted to be, like his message to be for the other young men. Like, you don't have to gang bang, you don't have to sell drugs. You can get a job, save up some money, and start a business. Ownership was one of those things that I feel like he really stood on. He wanted to see black-owned businesses. He wanted to see black people doing well, and I think that was like him. I think him having that leadership from the guy who gave him the store, the older man who gave him the store. I think that was one of the things that he kind of wants to do for his community. He wants to be like a leader for the younger generation that is involved in gang banging. Like we see him throughout the story where they say that Khalil used to work at the store, and then the other younger gentleman, he ended up getting a job at the store, the grocery store. And I think Maverick does that because that's how he got his start. Somebody helped save him, so now he wants to help and save everyone else. And I think that's kind of what our communities are lacking now. For example, like myself, I grew up on the south side of Chicago and Chatham, but there wasn't very many people. There aren't any people that you can really turn to, especially black men, that are doing like positive things for the community. There's a very few, but they're not like right directly in the area that I grew up in, which makes it kind of hard because the only time that you really see it is on social media versus like you're not seeing these people in person, and they're not helping you directly, so it's kind of hard to kind of grasp that idea of what's really going on. But having that leadership is something that we're lacking because if you don't have somebody like guiding you or telling you what to do, you kind of just grow up learning, making mistakes, and then just completing like just redoing the same cycle, which could be a bad thing, which is a bad thing because just kind of like freehand in life in a way, without any proper guidance, and time is something that you can't get back. So once you go through all of that time and trying to figure all of that out, it kind of makes it hard to kind of get back on the right path. And if you do, it's going to be much later in life when it's kind of too late. Yeah, so I mean, some other causes and effects of growing up in that area for Maverick, I feel like, was raising his children. I think that's where he kind of contradicted himself a lot throughout the book. He seen the Garden Heights as a place of hope that could get better, but he didn't want his children to go to school there. And I think that's kind of um, where he kind of was contradicting himself at. Also, like him not wanting his children to move out of that area. Like, he didn't want them to move out of the area. He wanted them to grow up in Garden Heights, but he didn't want them to go to school there because he felt like they needed a better education. Um, but we see that that doesn't really work out because that creates other problems, such as the identity crisis that Star went through. Um, I feel like it's important. Like, I understood, like, his intentions were good, but I feel like he didn't, like, completely think it out. Um, if you're going to send your children to a better school because you want them to get a better education, I think moving them to the suburbs, which we see they did end up moving towards the end of the novel. They ended up moving to the suburbs. I think that's what he should have been did. Keeping them in an area like that where they have to grow up and experience things that their peers who are going to school with won't experience. It's kind of like torture in a way because you're making them go, like, we know this is a pretty bad and rough area and you want them to grow up in that, but you also want them to have the fruits and benefits of growing up at school in the predominantly white areas, which leads to identity crisis, and that can be tough on a child. And luckily for Star, she was able to find herself because she was going through such a traumatic situation. But what if Khalil didn't die and she wasn't going through a traumatic situation? Like, how long would it have taken her to kind of realize that she was a black woman and what being a black woman meant? You kind of don't know. And I think that was one of the the bad effects of her going to school out there, and Maverick keeping them in Garden Heights. He had good intentions with, he wants them to get the experience of what it is to be black in this area, and he wants to show them that, like, this area can change, but he didn't believe that it could change without them being directly there. And we see that he was obviously wrong about that. Like, you can still make a change. All it takes is you making a commute to your community and still actively working in that community. And I think that's what a lot of people don't do in today's times. Is we see a lot of people, if we want to use like actual wealthy people or people who we know are rich, we see a lot of people come from these areas, but they don't ever come back and they don't give back to this community. And I think that's one of the main things that kind of leads our communities in a on a bad path, is when we don't have people coming back, actively donating to the community, actively working in the community, or trying to build businesses in the community. And I think that was one of the great things that Maverick really stood for. And also, another character that we can kind of dive into was Uncle Carlos. And throughout the book, I didn't really care for Uncle Carlos, but I think he played a very important role because there's a lot of black men that actually play the role that Uncle Carlos played. When Maverick went to jail, Uncle Carlos was there and stepped up for Maverick while he was away. And this is something that happens in a lot of communities. For myself, for example, my father went to jail when I was young, but my mom, she was married, so I had a stepdad there that stepped up and kind of played the role of what, a man should. And I think that was kind of important because as a community, we have to stick together, and I also think it's very important for families to stick together. And although Maverick and Uncle Carlos kind of butted heads a lot, I think at the end of the day, they both had great intentions, except Maverick was what most people would call a street guy or a hood guy, and Uncle Carlos was the kind of like the good guy, the one that everybody would want to be like, or that people would want their children to be like. And I think that's kind of like they came from like two different spaces, but they came from the same area, both coming from Garden Heights. And I think Uncle Carlos, his house specifically, Like if we're talking about location, his house was kind of the a scapegoat for the children and their wife as well. Well, Maverick's wife and their mother. They would like to go out to his house because it was in the suburbs. It was nice. The area was nice. His house was nice. It was nice and big. It was spacious. And I think that's kind of like something that they don't really see too often in Garden Heights are like big homes or clean areas and things like that. And also it's like a safe area. Right? They didn't feel like they had to watch people get shot or be robbed and things like that. Like his house served as a safe spot for them whenever something bad was happening in Garden Heights. And I think that's kind of important. Like we all have to have that safe space, but I think it's also important that we make our own communities that safe space. Uncle Carlos was one of those people where they moved out of Garden Heights, but they, like outside of work, they didn't do anything in Garden Heights. And he was a police officer, which is good work, and we do need more black police officers. But we also see in the beginning of the book that Uncle Carlos was kind of the black police officer that would let his white colleagues slide with saying things, get away with doing things, and he was kind of like a Blue Lives Matter type of person, until he started to really see how this situation was really affecting Star and the things that people were saying. It kind of started to hit home for him because Star is like a daughter to him. And that kind of like made him come back to a reality that before he puts on that badge, before he puts on that uniform, he's a black man first. I think that was one of the best things that we've seen about Uncle Carlos was that transformation from him not just being a police officer, but him realizing that he's a black police officer. For example, when he found out that the white police officer that killed Khalil had pointed his gun at Star, and he kind of beat him up, and he got suspended from work for a couple of days for that. I think that's when he kind of realized, like, okay, that is my niece, and this situation is terrible, and he didn't kind of like get the full scope of things until that. And I think that, like, when we talk about police officers, like him being a police officer, I also think that was kind of one of the things where him and Maverick bumped heads a lot, was because Maverick was an ex-gang member, and then Uncle Carlos was a police officer. Like, in a way, like they bumped heads a lot, but I think they gave the children like a great perspective on things. Like Maverick is a successful business owner. He runs his grocery store, and Uncle Carlos is, you know, a police officer. He has a good job, a good paying job. And I think like the children kind of got like the best of both worlds when it came to that, because not often do we see black police officers. Like me personally, I don't know any black police officers, but I can name a bunch of ex-gang members. And I think this is something that we see throughout the hoods of America in all of our locations, is we don't always have both spectrums of like what it looks like to be successful or what a good black man looks like. And I think that's something that's very important. But I also believe that that's why, like towards the end, we see Uncle Carlos, like he starts to actively try to help, like with the young man who they took in, because he was kind of being like chased down by his gang like friend members, gang leader. He was being chased down for owing him some money, and we see Uncle Carlos take him in. And I think that was one of the good things about it, was that like he didn't feel like he was too good to do it, but at first he kind of wasn't open to the idea. But he's seen how important it was to have that representation, and that the community kind of needed someone like him. And he ended up taking him in. I thought that was pretty cool of him, because I can like in the beginning of the book, he wasn't that type of person to do something like that. And then at like this Khalil situation kind of like made everyone in the book have a change of heart for things. I mean, but for Maverick, it was kind of like the only thing about Maverick like being in that situation was how close to home it was for his daughter, like her being right there, like she could have easily died. And I think that even though that still wasn't enough for him to like want to move them out, I think just like after the arguments with his wife and just like the riots and everything that was happening, and also their home being like shot up, I think that's what kind of like was like the drawing line for him. And yeah, so that's my take. The Hate You Give was a really good book, and I think as we see throughout the book that like there's negative effects to growing up in what most people would call the hood, but I like to call them marginalized minority field areas. There's great causes and effects that happen, but there's also a lot of negative. When you look at the different spaces in these books, they all kind of stand as like a scapegoat for like the various characters, and each location kind of represents like a safe place or a place of comfort for each character. Um, and that's my take.